Some guardians think that their ELL students don't need specialized support for one of two reasons: that their student will develop English faster without their primary language dragging them behind, or that bilingual and ESL programs are for those with disabilities. This suggests that English is more important than their primary language. However, this is not true. The first method is essentially a sink or swim method. According to Saltero, students who endure the first method are put through the same expectations to learn the language and academic skills as students who have been learning or already know English. Denying ELL students specialized support is setting them up for failure and supporting the ideology to assimilate their students into the dominant culture, and leaves no room for integration, leading to subordination. This is especially dangerous, for it devalues their primary language in favor of the dominant one, causing cultural shame and leads to subjective bilingualism. Denying the student of ESL and bilingual programs due to the idea that the programs are only for students with disabilities is wrong for the same reasons, as well as perpetuating the myth that students with disabilities learn slower and less than students without. There's a common misconception in society that immigrants refuse to learn English. This view devalues and ostracizes those who speak another language and perpetuates the view that immigrants are lazy. However, this is simply not true, for we are seeing an increase in immigrants learning or that know English as of the past 2 years. Some immigrants that do not know English encounter the accessibility issues for education programs due to work needs, or the realization that some of these programs produce subtractive bilingualism, causing discourse between ELLs and those who speak their primary language. This myth needs to be dismantled, for it perpetuates stereotypes and places value on English speaking compared to other language, which causes ELLs to prefer English and possibly experience subtractive bilingualism of their primary language, causing the discourse mentioned. Lastly, guardians who are non-English speakers of ELL students are suggested or decide to try and speak mainly English in their homes despite their proficiency. Similarly, guardians that want their students to learn both their home language and English might choose to have their students attend an English-only school while teaching their students at home their home language. This is an attempt to excel in English proficiency and be able to communicate and interact with their family, cultural, and community. These approaches tend to lead to English being the primary language of the student while shunning or forgetting their home language. There are several misconceptions here. The first one, with speaking only English at home, is that it promotes the idea that English is the language of power and Spanish is the language of the poor. The result of this prevailing ideology shows itself in dismantling the family unit at a social, cultural, and emotional level. The second family's misconception is hidden a little bit better, for they attempt to embrace Spanish at home, but it is the same as the previous families, for the student devalues their own home language for English, thus showing the prevailing ideology that is being prescribed to the student. In the DYSA video, there were two myths debunked that were suggested by Saltero that stuck out to me. The first myth debunked was the myth that learning two languages causes confusion. This school celebrated that their students spoke different languages, where most of the children were implied to know a type of English called Ebonics as a primary language, and they were trying to also learn mainstream American English as well. The school did so that they weren't stripping students of their primary language, which, as Alfaro and Bartolome state, one's primary language is inextricably linked to identity. Without one's identity, they begin to become lost and experience self-esteem issues due to the implicit hierarchy and where they stand in it. And as for these students' cases, they are non-standard English speakers. The other myth the video debunked was that errors should be corrected immediately. This is represented in a short clip of the video where a student is missing a conversion question. The teacher did not correct the student, however, gave the class a chance to help the student learn at the mistake in his answer. While learning a language, students might tend to make mistakes and errors, but that is a part of learning. As students continue to talk in their second language, they will pick up on corrections and correct themselves over time through practice. So it is not important to correct them immediately. Furthermore, if mistakes and errors were to be corrected immediately, we might run the risk of turning students away from learning, for they can become embarrassed to make mistakes and thus never overcome them. The teacher demonstrated covert policy by accepting and understanding his students by responding this way. From my understanding, he took control of the covert policies in his classroom to ensure a supportive and inviting learning space by demonstrating that both languages were equally valued. The teacher demonstrated perception as well because he understood where his students were from and their cultural values, so using this to his advantage, he set up the game to teach how sentences in their language, Ebonics, is spoken in another language, the mainstream American English, while still valuing their home language. In the teacher's instructions, he showed that he understood his views and beliefs and enacted upon what was best for his students by having his students point out the differences in sentence structure between the two languages while using language such as COPE to transcribe between the two languages. This word shows that the teacher was not placing more value on standard English, for it is a softer term uh, than, say, translate. There were three strategies I noticed from the teacher. One of the strategies I've just mentioned is how thoughtful he was in his word choice, to not intimidate his students while using familiar terms. Furthermore, he was patient by not correcting them right away, but rather he gave other students the opportunity to answer. By not immediately correcting his students, he acknowledges that his students have equal power over the classroom as he does, regardless of race or language spoken. Another tool that the teacher used was that, along with transcribing the sentence from one language to another, he had students identify the differences between the two by saying something along the lines of, "What linguistic features is not mainstream American English?" This allows students to identify the differences while validating their primary language. I think that supporting both languages in the classroom was not just a great part to being ideologically clear, but also to support their academic learning directly. Because according to Saltero, there has been studies that show those who are proficient in multiple languages experience advantages cognitively and academically. Furthermore, the activity was cognitively demanding of the students, making them think about differences of the language while focusing on the content provided, which is indicated by the Cuman's language quadrant chart, is an activity that will be beneficial to developing the academic language, mainstream American English. As for the second strategy, this is a good way to not discourage the students, but rather enlighten and encourage them to keep trying. There are a lot of misconceptions about those who are language learners in the classroom that lead to biases and possible negative results. But that can be changed because, according to Alfaro and Bartolom, um, they state that if educators are to have a breakthrough it, in how to make their classes better or equitable, they must first become ideologically clear, particularly on issues of standard and non-standard language use in dual language classrooms. So as to announce and denounce ideological and structural obstacles to teaching for equity and justice. I think from what we saw of the teacher in the video, he displayed this very accordingly. The teacher supported motivation and attitude as well as a level of proficiency in L1 by having his students work in groups where they relied on each other to get the right answer before other teams. This helped students with motivation by giving them a goal and a system that was relying on the student, which can also attribute to a better attitude about the activity. Furthermore, the activity used material they were familiar with and used simple sentence structures to make students less stressed about the activity. The external factors for language acquisition were outlined by the teacher by him being kind and thoughtful of his students and letting mistakes and errors be learning experiences that are taught by peers rather than the teacher being the all-knowing being. The activity was embedded with content because they were provided with initial sentences but were required to come up with the mainstream American English forms, thus reducing the content a little bit. Other strategies that could be drawn from Bailey et al. Would be to truly listen, be accessible, and carefree students. This approach could benefit students by sharing expectations and develop mutual respect between students and teachers. Also, by being a good listener, it reduces self-consciousness, which results in increased student involvement, especially in language classes. In my own practice, I plan on bringing a critical viewpoint to examine myself as I teach. I want to do that so that I can be unbiased when engaging and evaluating my students in order to clear misconceptions as early as possible. By clearing misconceptions, I can focus on providing an engaging curriculum that can play off of my students' level of understanding as well as state standard requirements. I do not imply that I will go easy on my students, but rather challenge them without pushing them too far.